Bill Haney. I was born in the Swedish Hospital in Minneapolis, October 6, 1922. And I had relatives in Madison, Minnesota, where my mother grew up and met my father. And at the age of 2, we moved to Los Angeles, California, where I went through elementary school, junior high, and high school, and went to Los Angeles City College for 2 years prior to enlisting in the Army Air Force on September 14th, 1942. And was called to active duty at Santa Ana Air Base, went through pre-flight, went through the selective process, and was number 1 was pilot training and number 2 navigation. I went to Army primary at Dos Palos, California in the summer of 43. We got in 40 hours of flight time and got washed out. Went back to Santa Ana Air Base for reclassification and was sent then to Las Vegas Army Air Base for aerial gunnery training. And from there then we were given 2 weeks leave after completion of the Las Vegas aerial gunnery training, and went to Hondo, Texas for navigation training. And in March of 44 I was commissioned as a second lieutenant and was sent to Dyersburg, Tennessee, which was a B-27 phase training. And the crew had already been there and had completed phase 1 training. So as a navigator, I was the 10th man added to the crew. We went through phase 2 and phase 3. And then I think because of the imminence of the invasion, they shortened the training period at Dyersburg, and we were sent early to Kearney, Nebraska, where we received a brand new B-17 that we mistakenly thought was going to be our combat plane. And we flew from Kearney, Nebraska to Rainier Field in Manchester, New Hampshire, and stayed overnight there, and flew from Manchester, New Hampshire to Gander, Newfoundland. And we stayed, I think, 2 days in Gander because of weather, and then flew nonstop from Gander to North Ireland. Nuts Corner was the name of the base. And we were in Nuts Corner, Northern Ireland for a couple days, and then they put us on a C-47 and flew us over to England. And we ended up in a base in England where we stayed for about a week, and then were shipped down to Bovington, England, where we went through some crew training. From Bovington, we went up to the 96 Bomb Group at Snetterton Heath, and we flew practice missions for about 2 weeks. Then our first combat mission was July 4th, 1944. And then we flew missions intermittently there, and they were going fast at that time. We got 1 leave into London, came back, and on the 9th mission, we were going to Regensburg. And it's the first mission I flew without my regular crew. And the mission was to Regensburg, and there was bad weather. And they were going south along the Rhine River trying to find a break in the clouds to get through, and they kept going higher and higher, and they got up about 25,000. And they found a break in the cumulus clouds right over Stuttgart. And the empty space in the cloud bank there was full of flak, and they took the formation through the flak there, and that's where we got shot up there. And later on I found that several of the planes in the bomb group turned around after getting shot up badly and went back to the base, and we kept on going, and we kept getting shot up we passed from one flak battery to another there, and again we were in the clouds so they couldn't see us, but they sure shot us up. So we got a hit in number 3 engine and got an oil fire, and they couldn't get the oil fire out, and they figured the gas tank was going to blow, so the pilot ordered everyone to bail out. So we bailed out in the clouds and tried to perform a delayed jump so as to give myself a better chance to evade. And I finally broke through the clouds and popped the chute and drifted down. But I had the misfortune of landing right outside of a small town. So I had a reception committee waiting for me there when I arrived. And I gathered the chute up there and tried to take off, but it didn't pan out. So some of the civilians were kind of angry. Again, they may have had a justification for it. This one guy pulled a nickel-plated gun out. He was trying to pull me away from the crowd so that he wouldn't shoot the civilians there. But at that time, the Luftwaffe soldier showed up on a bicycle. So he marched me then into the police station in the town. And then the co-pilot ended up in the police station too. We stayed overnight in a jail in this small town outside of Stuttgart. And then they put us on a train. We went up the Rhine there. And we stopped at these towns and picked up other air crews that were shot up. I remember we carried one guy on a stretcher with a broken back, and he died on the train. And then you'd see these other guys standing at the station waiting to be picked up, and they had their heads wrapped in paper bandages and that. And B-24s really got clobbered that day. They lost, I don't know, I think 14 or 16 planes. And so we ended up at Frankfurt, Germany, and went through interrogation, and they put us in one interesting thing was that when I got there, they had me in the preparatory to putting me into this cell, and looking down the hallway were a whole bunch of civilians, men in civilian clothes, and I couldn't quite figure that out. And what happened was that the underground had been infiltrated in Holland and Belgium. They closed the escape route down for several months with the idea in mind that they were going to ferret out the Germans that were in the evasion stream there and get rid of them. And they thought they had. They opened it up and brought these fellows that had been in farmhouses and homes for 3 months there, and the Germans grabbed them right away. And again, this is how they ended up there at Stalag Luft in civilian clothes. So I was interrogated there by a lieutenant colonel from Los Angeles. And his greeting to me was, "I'll see you in Los Angeles after the war," which didn't set too well. So from there, they took us out into another, they released a whole bunch. I guess they wait till they have more crew members come in and they need the space, and then they turn you loose. So we stayed one night, and the Frankfurt got bombed by the RAF that night. They put us on a train the next day and set us up to Wetzlar, which was about 30 miles or so north of Frankfurt. And there was a Colonel Starth that was a P-47 pilot in Italy, and he was the commanding officer of the compound there. And we got some Red Cross food, that they had a kitchen. Then we got they took all the clothes I had. I had long johns and English wool socks and everything. Well, they were all infiltrated with lice and that, so I lost all my heavy clothing there. And again, the Red Cross gave us a cardboard or fiberboard suitcase that had toilet articles in it, and I got a blue wool sweater that some lady in the States had knitted there. And so that was a breath of fresh air to get some American items there. And we stayed there in Wetzlar, I think, for a day or two. They put us on a train, sent us up to Barth, Germany, where we arrived. They'd given us some Italian horse meat in large, I think, number 2.5 cans there, and we weren't too hot on taking any horse meat there, but it turned out we took them into the camp, and again, they were eaten up without saying. And this was, I think I arrived in Barth in August of '44. And at that time, North 2 was under construction. So they put us up in one or two tents in North 1 compound. We stayed there about a month until they completed North 2. And the weather in August in Barth was quite warm. A lot of the prisoners were running around in shorts and getting suntans and so on. And we moved into North 2, I believe, about the 6th or 8th of September of '44, and it turned cold and windy and the dust started blowing, and it was a complete change of temperature and climate there once we got into North 2. But we were moved into this, I think, Block 9, which is, they were all brand new buildings at that time. And W.T. Jones and Dusty Rhodes were the two in charge of the barracks. And we moved into the barracks, and we remember Schwiezow got a broken knife and he cut one of the boards in the floor to make an opening, so when we mopped the floor, we could get rid of the mop water there. So we pushed it down the crack in the floor there and got rid of it. But anyway, we had mattresses where they stuffed with wood shavings and so forth, and we had to do our own cooking. And we had a stove in the room, but the grate was way down below and we needed to duct the top, so we took the stove apart and rebuilt the thing and got the grate up high enough so we could cook, in that we had to prepare our own meals. Were in North 1, they had a mess kitchen there, so you really didn't do any cooking there. They served 2 meals in North 1. So we stayed in this barracks, and Pappy showed up there along with Bob Pierce, his bombardier. And then Pappy transferred out to another room, so we lost contact with him for a while. And then the Russians were moving west, and Luft 4 was a sergeant's prison camp for Air Force personnel in Poland. So the Germans evacuated that and moved some of the troops by train to Barth. And some of them were moved into North 2 and some into North 3. So they vacated the barracks we were in and put the enlisted gunners from Luft 4 into the barracks, and we moved into a room in the barracks that was known as the Wheels Barracks, where the officers of majority or lieutenant colonels or so forth were billeted. So we then kept getting more men in, and I think we ended up with 20 or better, and some were sleeping on the table and so forth, so we were kind of crowded. So we were there in this Wheels Barracks there at the time, and eventually the Russians got closer and the Germans decided to pull out, so they pulled out one night, and the next morning we woke up and there were American MPs in the guard towers instead of Germans, but again they still had machine guns and had them trained down on anyone there in the compound. So they had us locked in and wouldn't let us out. So one Sunday there, the Colonel Zemke, who was the commanding officer of the Luft 1, came marching down the concrete paved concrete road there that was to the west of North 2, and there was a Russian behind him with a machine gun, and we didn't quite understand what was going on, but Colonel Zemke yelled to tear down the fences and the wire, and Major Fisher was there, and he understood what the urgency was, so he yelled to everybody to start tearing things down, and everybody got into the spirit, and they really busted everything up and got out and tore up German barracks and so on. So after that, Colonel Zemke lost some control over us because he still could cut us off from town there, but again, there were ways of getting out into the potato fields to the east and that. And so we waited around for several days and finally decided it was time to to leave. And someone told us about a rowboat down on the reeds there on the inlet. So we decided we were going to leave. And Jack Murphy and Bob McFall and I took off one morning before light. We found the boat was full of eels, and we threw those out and rowed across the bay there. And then we started walking west then. We got to a farmhouse, and the lady, probably 30 years old, could speak English, and she had lived in New Jersey at one time. Her husband was in the German army on the East Front, and she'd been a telephone operator in Barth, and had left Barth there ahead of the Russians and moved in with her in-laws, who had this farm along the highway going west toward Wismar. So she wanted us to stick around because she was afraid of the Russians, felt we were some security there. So we stayed, I think, 2 days there, and we were sleeping in the front room on the floor, and Bob McFall during the night heard a noise, and he looks up, and the window goes up, and this foot comes through the window, and then a machine gun, and the Russian follows. So Bob McFall yells, Amerikansky, Amerikansky there, and the Russian didn't shoot us up like he might have if we thought we were German. So we then decided we better move down the road. So we took us about another 3 days, and we got to the British lines at Wismar. We ran into a roadblock there where the Russians were holding all the Kriegies up from going into the British lines. And there must have been 100 Kriegies there just milling around waiting for something to happen. Well, a British major came across the line in a Jeep. He was going to have tea with the Russian colonel there, and we talked to the British major and told him what our situation was and asked him if he couldn't intercede for us there. So sure enough, about another half hour, the word came out from the Russians that we were free to go. So we crossed the line and went into Wismar. And they were ready for us. They had barracks, and they fed us and that. And we went into town, and we found a wine cellar. We got some rope and some barrels and galvanized metal pails. We got a fella down into the wine cellar, and he filled the wine up there in the pails, and we pulled the pails up and filled bottles and barrel with it. And we went back to the barracks, and next morning a friend of Jack Murphy's came in, and Murphy says, well, help yourself, there's a barrel of wine there. So the fellow took a drink of the wine, and he just let out the room running as fast as he could. Well, what happened was that the acid in the wine had eaten the zinc off the pail, so he really got a mouthful of zinc there, which made him ill, really, is what happened. So we went out to the airport, the German airfield there at Wismar, and the Canadians were out there, and they had a bunch of duck eggs that they had, and they fried us up a bunch of duck eggs, which was the first time I'd ever eaten them. And they had confiscated all the German civilian automobiles in the town of Wismar, and they must have had 30 or 50 of them lined up at the airport. The Canadians said, well, why don't you take one of these cars and drive it to Brussels, and you can sell it for $2,500. So that sounded real good to us. So there were 2 gunners, 2 enlisted sergeants, and Jack Murphy and myself. So we split up, and I and a gunner and Jack Murphy and a gunner got each into a car and took off. Well, the car I had, the generator went out the first day, and we had a problem we couldn't get anybody to repair it. And we finally found a battery, so we rigged up some wires from Murphy's car into the back seat of his car with a dead battery, and charged it up and kept switching batteries around to keep going. So we headed west then, and they said, well, you have to go across the Elbe at Hamburg. And they said, the British are there, and you'll never get across. So we sailed up to it. There was a British lieutenant there, and we explained who we were and what the situation was, and we were trying to get home. He said, you're a bunch of bloody rogues, he says, and he waved us across the bridge. So we got across the Elbe. Then the British put us up in a German civilian home that night. And the next day we got to Hanover and we stayed with some Canadian tankers there, and then we took off and went through Bremen, which is in the American hands, but we really had no problems with the Americans there, and then we took off for Holland. We got about 40 miles from the Dutch border and we ran into a Canadian roadblock. And they said, "This is the end of the line for you, park it over there." And we were, again, we were not the first ones to try this. They had probably about 15 civilian cars that they had confiscated. So they put us on a truck and sent us into Nijmegen in Arnhem. That's where the General Montgomery had tried to push north in the operation they called Market Garden in September of '44, and it stalled, and they lost a lot of paratroopers and Americans and British too. So anyway, the Germans had stayed in Holland longer than they had elsewhere. So they had just left at the time we got there, and the Dutch were having a street dance celebrating, and they were out whooping it up and so on. So the British gave us British uniforms there, and we had tam and British boots and wool pants and a battle jacket. So they put us on a train and gave us $40. They said it'd reverse Lend-Lease funds and sent us down to Namur, Belgium. We were back in the American hands then. Then from Namur we went by train down to Camp Lucky Strike. So when we arrived in Lucky Strike, the fellow prisoners up at Barth had gotten there ahead of us. They were waiting for us and wanted to know where we'd been, what had been going on. So there was an airfield there at Camp Lucky Strike, and a lot of the planes from around Europe there were flying in trying to find friends of theirs who had been prisoners of war. So Murphy had been in a service group in North Africa, and he decided he wanted to get back to his wife, and it was going to be a long war, so he volunteered for combat, went up to the 15th Air Force in Italy and got shot down. So he decided he wanted to try to look up the service group that he'd been with in North Africa, and found out that they were in Nancy, France, which was over on the German border. So we talked the B-26 group that came down to fly a captain from Barth back to Belgium there, and they flew us up there, and then we talked them into flying us toward Nancy, and they landed on a French airfield in France, and we hitchhiked about 40 miles and got to Nancy. Well, the service personnel there welcomed Jack Murphy with open arms because they hadn't seen him in a couple of years. So we stayed with them for a while, and then they flew us into Paris, and they had an apartment in Paris for R&R. So they put us up there for a couple nights in Paris, and the thing that I look back on fondly was that they got us tickets to the Glenn Miller band who was playing at the Olympia Theater. Glenn Miller was dead. He went down in the English Channel on December 14th of '44. But Jerry Gray was the arranger, and he was running the band. And the band just blew the roof off the theater that night. They were, again, I imagine it was a normal production, but again, the audience really accepted them greatly. And then the group then flew us from there back to Le Havre, and we hitchhiked from Le Havre back to Lucky Strike. And eventually then Murphy then went back to the U.S. by ship, and I was reading the Stars and Stripes, and the bomb groups were flying home from England, so I thought I'll get home real quick and go back to the 96th bomb group. So I got into Paris and went out to Orly, and there was a C-47 there. I went up to the first lieutenant pilot and asked him if I could have a ride back to England, and he said no. He says, I got too many Kriegies I'm promised rides to. He said, there's no room for you. So I said, the hell with that. So there was a Navy captain there, so I went up to him and explained who I was, and I was trying to get back to my bomb group in England, and he said, sure, we got plenty of room. So it turned out that really the main occupant of the plane was General Wild Bill Donovan, head of OSS, and he was sat in the back of the plane. I had no contact with him, but anyway, they had a person on the plane, and they served us, they had regular seats, and they served us cold pineapple juice. The flight back to England was 1 year after D-Day, June 6th of 1945. We landed at Bovington, and they had some big Army cars there with the general stars on them, and I guess they didn't know how many people he was bringing back. Well, anyway, they put us in one of the cars, and we rode into London, and all the personnel were saluting the car down the road. So then I went from there up to my bomb group with the idea in mind that I'd fly home. So I checked in with them, and I said, when are we going home? And they said, we're not going home, we're being sent to Germany to photograph Germany. So I said, boy, so long, I'm not sticking around. So I headed back and ended up in a camp in Southampton. And again, it was a tent city down there, and they couldn't tell you anything about it. So there was a seaside resort at Bournemouth, which was about 60 or 80 miles to the west. And the personnel that were there at Southampton apparently decided Bournemouth was a better place to stay. So that's where a lot of us ended up, and they had a Red Cross hotel there, so we were able to stay in the hotel. And we went back and forth trying to intercept messages and so forth. Well, it just dragged on and on. Well, finally we did get a call to go up to Manchester, England, which is in the Midlands, and there's a canal that runs from Liverpool to Manchester, and there was a Liberty ship there that was going to take us home. So we checked in with the captain up in Manchester, and they were loading scotch on the ship, and he says, the way things are going, we're not going to leave for another 2 weeks. So we went to a Red Cross club in Manchester and stayed. Now, there were only 4 of us that from Barth that were in this group that were going on the Liberty ship. So we waited around there for about a week, and we got a call from Liverpool, from the American Council in Liverpool, that they had a Liberty ship coming down from Murmansk, Russia. And if we got there that weekend, then we'd ship out Monday. So we went over to Liverpool and checked in with the council and that, and then we went out to the ship, and they brought a load of lumber down. They had it on the deck there, lashed down. And they had 2 U.S. Navy subchasers that they lashed to the back aft of the Liberty ship, and they were taking those back to the States. So we had very good accommodations there. We had two cabins on top of the top side there, and there were two of us to each cabin. So we left Liverpool on the 31st of July, and we were out in mid-Atlantic when they dropped the A-bomb. And the radio operator on the Liberty ship picked it up, and we didn't understand the implications of it. We knew something had happened there. So we were originally scheduled to go into New York Harbor, and I'd never seen the Statue of Liberty or been there, and I figured this was a great chance to see it. They changed our orders, and we went into Newport News, Virginia instead. And we ended up at Camp Patrick Henry, and we stayed there a couple days, and then they had a troop train. I again lived in Los Angeles, so they had a troop train that was going west. And the bulk of the personnel on the troop train were the 10th Mountain Division from Italy. And they were ski troops that had been trained at Camp Carson, Colorado, but they never got a chance to use their skis in Italy. They were infantry. And so we had a week's trip. We went all over from Patrick Henry, went up north into Ohio, down to Indianapolis. We went south to Kansas City, turned and went north up into Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming. We turned south and went through Salt Lake City and Las Vegas, and finally into San Pedro, California, where Fort McCarthy is. So that eventually I got back to the States, but it didn't get back as quickly as I had hopes of. Mm-hmm. So then from there I had to leave, and I'd heard about the hotels that the Air Force had at Santa Monica. I it sounded great, and I ran into Bob McFall. He had gotten back earlier, and he was out at Santa Monica, the hotels. Well, anyway, by the time my leave had run out, they'd closed the hotels down in Santa Monica, so I ended up back at Santa Ana Air Base, where I went into the Air Force. So I was out there for about a week, and I ran into Leonard Clark. He was getting discharged at the same time. So I wanted out, and I found out that USC, who was on a tri-semester basis at that time, was having a new semester begin in November. So this was in the first part of November, so I had accrued leave and got discharged effectively on December 16th, but I started USC in November and finished up 2 years in June of '47 and majored in accounting. Well, that really is about the end of the deal. My father passed away from a heart attack. My mother decided she wanted to get out of Los Angeles. It was too damp and that, so we sold her house and moved to Tucson. My brother was in the Army in Japan at the time, and he came down with rheumatic fever and ended up in the hospital in William Beaumont General Hospital in El Paso. So in August of '47, we drove to see him, and he got a discharge, and we all ended up in Tucson, Arizona, in February of 1948.
Well, thanks a lot. Give us, what do you think about the future a little bit?
Well, I'm optimistic. Again, we've had tough times. Whatever's happened, we seem to be able to surmount whatever the emergency is and go ahead. And again, I think the men of our generation, I think, really had a better foundation for life than what children of today have. And again, it's not, I don't know that it's the children's fault. I think it's the training they've had in their family there as to what is correct and what is not right to do. And again, having gone through a depression, I think that had something to do with the stamina or grit that our generation had, that we knew things weren't easy and we didn't expect them to be handed to us on a silver platter, that whatever we got, we figured we had to work for and earn. I think that may be a difference. Of course, in the meanwhile, we've had a huge inflation, and money really doesn't mean an awful lot compared to what dollars bought when we were growing up. So it's a totally different economic situation. I think money comes too easy today, and as a result, it really doesn't have the meaning that it had when we grew up.
Well, you told us an interesting story, Bill, and it was detailed enough that we could follow along and kind of get to know you.
I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be